one of the first pioneers to settle Cades Cove in the Great Smoky Mountains. He lived as one with the land until the American Civil War threatened to destroy his mountain oasis. One man would have to stand up and fight to save his family and his entire community. This is the true story of Russell Gregory. In many ways, Russell Gregory was one of the last true pioneers of the endless forest of Appalachia. Born in the mountains of North Carolina, less than 2 decades after the birth of the United States, the frontiersman grew up as wild and free as the animals who called these rugged wilds home. He learned to navigate the dense thickets of mountain laurel and rolling mist of the highlands with the same sure-footed grace as the Cherokees who he learned from. Russell made his home for a time at the top of Chistoye Mountain, which towers at nearly a mile high, a massive sentinel in the wall of wilderness separating Tennessee and North Carolina. The Cherokees named this mountain Chistoye, meaning the place of the rabbit. Unlike other peaks surrounded with thick forestry, Chistoye was a bald. Its summit was swathed in lush, waving grasslands. It was here that Mr. Gregory built his 2-story log cabin with his own hands, using timber hewn from the lower forest and stones gathered from the wandering creeks. The cabin was fortified against the elements and wild intruders. It was more than a shelter, and for a while, he lived there in the pioneer spirit on the edge of the frontier, far from the white settlements down in the valley, and deep in what was considered the kingdom of the Cherokees. However, the landscape of Russell's life was about to change drastically. You see, in 1819, the United States negotiated the Treaty of Calhoun, which ended the Cherokee claims to the large mountain valley that laid just over the Tennessee side of Chistoye. This fertile valley was named Cades Cove in honor of the Cherokee chief Cade, who once ruled here. But now that valley beckoned settlers with its rich soil and abundant wildlife. Russell Gregory was among the first 3 white men to move their families to this mountain oasis. They quickly built a grist mill by the stream that meandered through the valley, setting their sturdy plows to the earth to raise crops and cattle. And here, the Gregory family expanded in this secluded paradise, raising 4 boys and 4 girls in a home that was filled with love, discipline, and respect for the wilderness that provided for him. Russell was a loving father, especially when it came to his son Charles. Oh, he never strayed from his side. He taught him a deep reverence for God and for country. Together, they would embark on bear hunts that stretched out for weeks. And during this time, Russell taught Charles how to shoot with his trusty rifle he affectionately named Long Tom. The gun had been handmade many years ago, and each time its barrel was aimed, its target was sure to fall in a cloud of smoke and thunder. The gun was truly one of a kind because it had provided both meat and protection for the Gregory family, and it was the father's most valuable possession. As the years folded into decades, more families who were seeking the simpler pioneer way of life made their way into Cades Cove. Blacksmiths, carpenters, beekeepers, weavers, you name it. There were craftsmen of every trade. More and more log cabins were built, along with churches and schools. Each person played a vital role in the community. For Russell, he tended to the cattle, and during the growing season of each year, the fertile soil of the valley was needed for the vegetable crops. So, Russell would drive the cattle out of the cove and up the 5.5-mile trail of Chistoyi Mountain to graze on the grasslands that the mountaineer knew so well. The trip to the top of the mountain was so exhausting that Russell built a stone house at the top where he and Charles would live with the cattle until the crops were harvested down below in the valley. Only then would they drive the cattle back down. And so it was. The children grew and then spread out in the cove to start their own families. And by 1860, remarkably, there were nearly 700 people living in Cades Cove. For 40 years, they had lived in harmony with the land and the seasons. Yet, as the winds of change swept across America, whispers of a looming conflict began to seep into the valley. That's right, the war between the states, a storm of conflict and division, threatened to tear apart the very fabric of their peaceful existence. The valley that had once united pioneers under the banner of survival was now cleaved by ideology and loyalty, and soon every man would have to choose a side in a conflict that pitted brother against brother, and as it would turn out, father against son, in the bloodiest conflict in American history.
Give someone you love the gift of old-fashioned storytelling today. 2 volumes that'll make your heart smile. Click the link below or visit the appalachianstoryteller.com to order your copies today.
By 1861, Russell Gregory was now 66 years old, and although he was long in the tooth, the years of mountain living had taken a toll on his body. He walked with a severe limp and had little use of one arm. He was in no shape for a war, and like many people in Cades Cove, he was a staunch patriot who supported the Union cause. But there was also a strong sentiment of Confederate supporters, so much so that church services frequently became ground zero for heated arguments and division. Union supporters sat on one side of the church and Confederates on the other. Finally, all church services in the valley were canceled out of fear that there would be bloodshed during one of the meetings. Every able-bodied young man soon left the cove to fight for one side or the other. Even Russell's house was divided, with 2 of his sons fighting for the North and 2 fighting for the South. Charles, who had long been his father's pride and joy, had made the decision to fight for the Confederates, and soon he crossed over the North Carolina line to join Company F of Colonel Thomas's Legion. By 1862, Cades Cove was a community of old men, women, and children, and that put them in a very vulnerable position. The mountains that surrounded them soon became full of renegades, deserters from both armies, and bands of guerrillas who attacked mountaineers and farmers for supporting one side or the other. Soon, Cades Cove became the favorite target for these desperados as they looted their crops, stole their cattle, dishonored their women, stole their guns, and burned their cabins. For 2 solid years, no one in the valley was safe from these attacks. And by the winter of 1863, folks barely had enough food to eat. Suspicion ran wild, as folks who were once neighbors and took care of one another now didn't know who to trust. Russell knew something had to be done, or else the community was going to be completely ransacked and abandoned. He had had enough. It was time for action. And by the spring of 1864, he organized all the men who were left in the cove, along with all the weapons they could scrounge. They developed a plan that they would follow the next time they were invaded. Each day, all the children would climb the surrounding hills to strategic locations where they could monitor the trails. And each time an intruder was located, the children would blow unique sounds from animal horns, signaling an impending attack to the valley below. Women would hide all the valuables underneath the floorboards and in the creek beds. Men would hide the cattle out in the forest, and then everyone would take cover hiding in a secret cave. And for a while, the plan worked, until the Confederates adapted and began conducting raids during the night, using the main path out of the cove to steal precious milk cows. Russell realized that hiding would no longer work. The women and the children would surely starve to death if the few menfolk that remained didn't fight. Next time they entered Cades Cove, there would be hell to pay. By the winter of 1864, the Civil War had nearly tore apart the settlement. Nearly starving and out of options, Russell Gregory developed a plan to ambush the Confederates, who were crossing the North Carolina mountains and invading his homeland. The main path that led into the cove followed along Abrams Creek, and it was here that he would carry out his plan. On a cold, snowy night in December, Confederate Company F of Thomas's Legion once again attacked Cades Cove. The group was comprised of fearless white men and Cherokees who ruthlessly fought side by side. And as they made their way into the cove, once again the children sounded their horns, and everyone ran to hide in the hills and caves. But this time, Russell left all the cattle as bait for the outlaws. Then, all of Russell's men made a frantic run for Abrams Creek, where they cut down a dozen trees, making it impassable for the soldiers to escape. And sure enough, an hour later, the sound of hooves could be heard approaching, as the Confederates had stolen every head of cattle and were leading them out of the cove. Russell commanded his men to flank both sides of Abrams Creek. They would attack in 2 waves at his command. As soon as the rebels were within range, the mountaineers opened fire. Each time one regiment fired, they quickly reloaded as the second wave unleashed a hailstorm of hot lead. Several soldiers were wounded, and in the confusion, Company F abandoned all the cattle and retreated for the hills. The next morning, Colonel Thomas was assessing the damage and trying to determine who had launched the sneak attack against them. And that's when one man stepped forward. That man was Charles Gregory. "Sir, I know who was responsible for this. I heard that rifle last night, and I know that sound anywhere. I learned how to shoot on that rifle, and that was the sound of Long Tom. That first bullet, it was fired by my father." That night, in the ultimate act of betrayal, Charles led the soldiers to his father's home under the cover of darkness. And there, they kicked his door in as his wife screamed in horror. Russell raised old Tom one last time, but before he could fire, he lost his balance and fell. The men drug him out of the cabin, where they took his own rifle, old Tom, and they shot Russell Gregory dead. Today, Russell Gregory is buried at the Primitive Baptist Church in Cades Cove. His son Charles, well, he's buried just a few feet away. Because Russell spent so much time on top of Chistoye Mountain during his lifetime, the Cades Cove folks named it Gregory Bald in his honor. Now, it still bears that name today, although thousands of people hike to its grassy summit each year in the Smoky Mountains. Few people know how it got its name. And the site of Gregory's heroic stand on Abrams Creek, well, it's still located today behind the Cades Cove Visitor Center. Sadly, there's not even a marker there to indicate the historic event that happened on that night in December of 1864, when the people of Cades Cove had had enough of the Civil War and they decided to fight. Now, my friends, you know the rest of the story. Be sure to like and subscribe for more true stories from Appalachia's past.